everybody, and welcome to another edition of the ProPrep Roundtable. This is episode 2 in our series that we're going to continue, hopefully do. Myself, David Taylor, Natalie Woods are here today to talk about training, and we're going to talk about today training intensity, and we're going to talk as well about advanced training techniques. Unfortunately, the other ProPrep coach Dave, Robert Brown today, he's not well. He's got his COVID booster jab, so that probably dates this podcast already, and he's not been able to make it. But we're going to soldier on without him. I think a few congratulations are also in order. So DT competed at the weekend, second in his lightweight class. Steve, season's kicked off. Are you happy with that?
Yeah. The season's goal was always to place in an open show and make a finals, and we've ticked that box in show 1, so hopefully just onwards and upwards from here.
Excellent. And then Natalie Woods, number of your ProPrep clients also competed at the weekend and did very well as well.
Yeah, they did awesome. It was literally only their second show of the season, and I'm so proud of them. They've just done amazingly. I can't believe that they've not done this before. So yeah, really proud.
Yeah, they did great. And personally myself, I had 4 athletes competing at the weekend. The guys did great. A big shout out to Kel Gallant, WNBF Pro now, won his show, WNBF Armenia. We had Dave, who we've mentioned already. James Clark took third in his own particular heavyweight class, really competitive. And then Andrew Lemoy on over 50. So by the end of the year, I think we're going to have had probably somewhere in the region of about 30 clients all in, having competed with ProPrep. So that's awesome. And I know they've all had a great experience competing as well. Okay, guys. So last time we did one of these roundtable discussions, please, guys, go and check it out. It was on total number of sets when you're exercising. We also talked about exercise selection as well. So that episode is available to download or to stream from wherever you get your podcasts from. Guys, if you like this content and you think that ProPrep coaching can help you get in shape, then we would love to work with you, whatever your goal is. You can check us out at www.proprepcoaching.com. Also check us out all on our socials as well, and all the usual places. It's ProPrep Coaching. You'll find us on Instagram and Facebook. Dave, what's your handle? Where can people find you on the gram?
So on Instagram, I'm David T Personal Trainer.
So you can find Dave on there. And Natalie Woods, where can we find you?
I'm Natalie Woods, 1804.
1804, and I am fueled by Scott's Oats. Okay, so last time when we did this, I was kind of the chair, but we're minus one person last time, so I'll maybe come in with a few more little bits of information on here. But who wants to start off here? Let's throw it out there. Exercise intensity seems like the way to start with then. So for hypertrophy or for strength training, who's coming on this? Do we need to train heavy? Do we need to train light? What do we think? Who wants to come in on this one?
Well, yeah, I'll come in on this one, and I think it's
go, Dave.
I think it's 2 different questions. I mean, obviously, intensity is more important than weight lifted for me. Like, you can have a really intense session lifting light weights, and you can have a really intense session lifting heavier weights. The bigger question would be, is one of them more effective than the other for building hypertrophy, or are they both kind of even?
Okay, I think as chair, I get to pull my weight around a little bit here and interject. Dave, can you give us some definitions for the listeners so that we're up to speed? So when we're talking about intensity, usually we're talking about loads lifted, but you're also talking about how hard you train, really, in terms of RPEs and things like that. So
okay,
some clear definitions that I think are helpful on this one. So come in on this one again, Dave.
Okay, well, that's the thing. I can only come at this from a personal perspective, but when I think
it's fine.
Intensity, I'm always thinking sort of like demand. I always think of it from an RPE perspective. It's like, how hard RPE, is that actual lift?
That down for us.
Rate of perceived exertion.
Okay.
So with like 1 out of 10 being it's like super easy, 10 out of 10 being like, I'm done. I can't finish the set. Like I literally could done everything I can on this weight. And for me, like that's always the yardstick I use to define for myself. Was this session demanding enough on my body to stimulate a change, which is obviously one of the main objectives we're looking for when we're lifting weights at the gym. We don't want to just tick boxes and move on. We want to actually build some new tissue. And that's done in my experience by asking the body questions it can't answer. So you've got to have those high RPE numbers So, because otherwise the body has no need to change. If everything's a 6 out of 10 when you go and do it in the gym, your body can already do all the things you're asking it to do. So no new tissue is required, no additional stamina is required, no additional strength is needed. So the adaptation requirement isn't there. So for me, if you're asking me like intensity, it has to be difficult enough to stimulate your body to make a change.
Dave, I think there's a great quote there you just gave us, which was asking the body questions that it can't answer. I think that's really nice. People should put that on their walls or get that tattooed on themselves. It's really, really good. Natalie, if I come to you, right, in terms of the RPE, and sorry to put you on spot on this, right? Does the RPE necessarily have to, do you have to lift heavy to have a high RPE, would you say? I mean, what's your take on this?
No, definitely not. And I think absolutely you can use a lighter weight and obviously go for sort of higher reps. And the way I sometimes think of it is that you make sure you're pushing yourself. So probably, I wouldn't suggest that you always push yourself to failure because it's very taxing longer term. So also, I almost think of it as from like a reps in reserve. So kind of going to a point where I kind of think I've maybe got 2 reps in reserve on this movement. But also the other point I go to is kind of like technical failure. So when I feel my form start to break down, rather than thinking, can I get this weight up any way possible? If I'm starting to say, if I'm doing something like RDLs and I'm starting to feel it in my lower back, I know that I'm not effectively working that muscle anymore. I know the fatigue's set in, my lower back's taking over, and I need to, there's no point me continuing with that set. But I also, because I think the problem with using kind of percentages of 1 rep maxes as well is that people can be quite inaccurate at estimating what their 1 rep max is. And, because it's not something you constantly want to be testing all the time, you could be underestimating based on that. So it's better to go on, your RPE and how you're feeling. And do you feel that you've kind of pushed yourself to that point, really? And it's absolutely what Dave was saying about kind of taxing the muscle in a way that it's not been taxed before, to give it a reason to adapt, to come back stronger. Otherwise, if you're doing the same you've always done and putting in the same level of effort, there's no reason for the body to change.
Yeah, and as you get more experienced, you get better at knowing where technical failure is as well. It's like what we were talking about last time, the difference between the Pee Wee coach and the NFL coach. They're teaching the kids the same move, but the youngster isn't going to get it the same way the experienced competitor will. And the longer you train, the more you know, okay, I'm lifting with my lower back now, or okay, my form's gone, so I know that the fatigue is set in, and that's a failure. Because when you are in the early stages, and I was a victim of this myself, you do always, you lift until you can't do it anymore. You lift until your back shape is like a banana. You know what I mean? Like, and helping people avoid this and understand what real intensity is. It doesn't need to be what you see on YouTube of these guys like bursting blood vessels in their eyes, lifting weights every week. Like it doesn't need to be like that to get the kind of progression we want.
And I think
if there was, sorry, Natalie.
I think it's counterproductive in the longer term if you're constantly pushing yourself to, like you say, bursting blood vessels, because you get the accumulated fatigue and then your training suffers in the longer term. You can't be doing that all the time. You also have to be mindful of recovery and how you're feeling after your sessions as well. And that's quite a good gauge, that if it's taking you a week to recover from something, then perhaps it's too much.
No, this is all great stuff, guys. A really nice open discussion on this. Now, obviously, I would say we were experts on this sort of stuff, but for those people who are non-expert coming into this, there's quite a lot of what I would call acronym soup going on here on this sort of stuff. So we've got RPEs, we've got RIRs, reps in reserves, rate of perceived exertions, 1RMs or percentage of RMs, and stuff like this. We've also got, I'm going to throw in another one here, we've got CNS recovery as well, central nervous system and stuff like that. So you can see it's complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on here. So I would say, right, for maybe the beginner or the advanced trainer, practically speaking, how can people actually use this stuff as the next thing I want to come in on this one. So we've had this pragmatic discussion about, okay, well, this is important and that's important and this is important. But when we're programming, say, for the the individual. Do you have a total number of sets that you would take to failure? I mean, or total number of sets that are reps and reserves? I mean, I've kind of blabbled on a little bit here. I know there's a number of questions within questions here. So if you want to kind of be brave and take the floor and try and break that down, then I'll put it out there now.
I
So
think,
Dave, are you coming in this?
yeah, this has evolved as I've gotten older with training. Because as I said, I mean, I was a typical bro lifter when I was in my early 20s. And that's probably one of the reasons why, I know, right? Why I have so many injuries now is because I didn't really know where the line was and what fatigue, you know, central nervous system fatigue actually was. So I would take pretty much all my exercises to failure or close to. Everything would be super heavy all the time. And that causes problems long term because your body can't do it. It's like every time you get in the car, you drive at 100, but you never get it MOT'd or serviced. You know, you got to look after your equipment. And I feel like now, I mean, again, personal, and it will depend person to person who I'm working with. Some people can take a bit more than others, but I think one exercise per session, you should push to some sort of technical failure, whether it's one of your compounds, whether it's one of your machine-based exercises, something that you know you're not going to injure yourself doing. So if I'm doing hip hinging,
can I just jump in there for a second, Dave?
Sorry.
Is there certain exercises you wouldn't take to technical failure, and is there certain exercises you think are more safe to take to technical failure? I realize that's kind of the same question. Sorry.
So with my lower back, I would never take a deadlift to a technical failure or a squat because there's more things that can go wrong if you go past the line. Like the classic YouTube videos of the guys on the bench press and they end up guillotining themselves. You know, like that's a problem. Taking that to technical failure, especially without a spotter, it creates more problems. Whereas if you're on a chest press machine or some sort of pulley based thing, you can go to failure on that. Simple, just reps to failure, not even taking into account drop sets, supersets, stuff like that, without the inherent risk of injury that you would have with these other ones.
Fair enough. Okay, so that I think that was a nice little aside. Put you back on point to where you were. You're talking about hip hinging.
Yeah, I would say like I would maybe have one exercise per session that I would push to failure or technical failure through either just a straight set or through, as we're going to get onto later, an advanced training technique such as a drop set, a superset, giant set, something like that. See, more terms to throw in to confuse people that would push the muscle into a place where it can't manage properly. Any more than that, and it's like beating a dead horse. You're not going to get any more out of it.
Okay, fair enough. I think that's good. Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that if you're going to sort of take something to failure in terms of exercise selection, then something that you can do safely, and it's like you say, I wouldn't do squats, deadlifts, anything like that. So, you know, if I was going to give someone, it might be something like dumbbell walking lunges where you can literally just drop them. You know, so I always think of it from that perspective of like what's going to happen. Like if you've got the weight on your back, obviously with deadlift you haven't, but the risk to your lower back if you sort of push that, get a really bad rep, and what can sort of happen from there, machines, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I never take squats to failure, and I just think the squats and deadlifts as well are the most sort of taxing movements that can give you the greatest level of fatigue. So you always have to balance it out on kind of a cost benefit ratio, really, that if that's going to fry you out for the rest of the session and make the rest of it less effective, then it's not a good idea anyway. And I tend to, like, if I'm going to do something to failure, I'd probably push it. I quite like pushing it towards the end of my session. So it's almost like a finisher for me, so that I know that I've kind of rinsed everything out that I possibly can.
Okay, that's a bit backwards because I'd normally put not that that's a backwards way to train. It's what I mean by that is I normally, when I've got all the energy in myself, I normally put like if I'm going to go to some sort of failure, it's probably going to be earlier on in the session rather than right at the end of the session. But in terms of, I totally get the rationale for it being safer to do at the end of the session rather than at the start of the session. So your training's not backwards.
I do it in the middle just to mix things up.
Dave does it in the middle.
I do it in the middle, enough that I'm warmed up, but not enough that I'm properly tired.
Okay. So I quite like this. So, I mean, taking things to failure or having that high RPE intensity, it seems like we're kind of on the same wavelength here, that you don't want to do it too much within a session. So you're probably going to what we would call positive failure, e.g. you can't do any more reps, and then technical failures at that point. The form's kind of broken down and you just kind of stop there. We don't push past that. And we really want to do that maybe a couple of times in the session, are we saying? And then after that, you want to probably train a little bit within ourselves. Is that what we're thinking?
Yeah, leaving a couple in reserve on some exercise, but at the same time, it should always be progressive. It's not a case of, okay, the weight I did last week and I got 3 sets of 10, let's say 50 kgs on the bench press. I'm going to go in and do the same thing today and I'll leave 2 in reserve. It should be, no, if it was 2 reps in reserve, 50 kgs, 3 sets of 10 last week, you should be doing 52.5 kgs this week and try and achieve the same amount while maintaining reps in reserve. It should always still have that progressive element to it as well.
Yeah, you should always kind of probably have about 1 rep in reserve. I mean, I'm not a fan of kind of 2 or 3, but 1, because that means you're working pretty hard, but you're not breaking things down. I sort of feel it with myself that the form's going to go a little bit from there. And I totally agree with your sentiments, Steve. When I first started working out and when I was in my 20s and stuff like that, the stuff that I would do in terms of the training, through pain, training through technical failure. I mean, like I did strongman, like, and that if you were in a compromised position a lot of the time, lifting these heavy weights, and it made me strong in ways that I've never been as strong as ever again. But in terms of my longevity, I don't think it did me any failure. And these days, I think I probably have much more quality. In the past, I would probably do 3 solid sets, RP 10 at that high intensity, so high loads. Now I probably do 2 or 1 is the big exercise from there, but the quality is better, and I think it probably helps my joints and allows me to maintain strength in the same way. I don't think I needed to do as many sets as I was doing, or at least that's my perspective. And I think at one time I was probably one of the strongest bodybuilders for the 90 kilo class and the middleweight class in the world. That's just my take on it. What about lifting heavy versus light? Where are we on that? How heavy do you have to go? 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%? What do we think?
I think I mostly like, the research behind it kind of suggests it's somewhere between kind of 60 and 80% is kind of that hypertrophy range. But there's also been research, which has been done on, I think it's mostly been done on kind of untrained individuals, where they've done this high reps versus kind of high reps lower weight versus the kind of heavier weight lower reps, and they basically found no real substantial difference between the two.
I've seen this stuff. You're right.
When you're obviously talking, say you were talking about someone who's obviously got a busy life and trying to fit it in, so the argument behind that was it's better to go heavier because it takes you less time to get to that point of failure, because the point was that they were training the muscle to failure, and obviously if you're using a lighter weight, that takes a longer amount of time to do so. But they found technically with the amount of muscle gain, there wasn't really any substantial difference. But again, that was in sort of untrained individuals. So how that would apply to someone who's got a little bit more training years behind them, I'm not sure. But
I can talk about that study actually a little bit. I forget the author, but what they essentially did was they took 2 loads. They take that 75 to 80% load, match the sets. So they're both doing 3 sets, for example, measure the muscle circumference. And then from there, they either get them to do, say, 8 reps, or they match the total amount of work to, say, a load which is 35% of your 1 rep max, and then you do higher reps. And the difference is, or the equal things are, it's the RPE is the same. Intensity is as high in both. So it's a 10 out of 10, really, really hard. And then you're right, what you see is similar muscle mass accretion from either method. They've done similar things as well with occlusion. So you will both be familiar with this. So with blood flow restriction training on a bicep, I mean, you can only really do it on the limbs. And then because it creates this ischemic state in the muscle, you get a lot of damage taking place in there. And if you go back and listen to that previous podcast we talked about with what actually causes muscle hypertrophy. It's that combination of chemical fatigue, metabolic fatigue, and load at the same time. And you're definitely ticking some of the boxes there when you're doing that occlusion stuff at the same time. So similar sort of stuff. So it's fascinating really when you look at it. Dave, do you want to just come in on this one as well? Just anything higher, low reps?
It was one of those classic things, again, when we were coming through, where it was like you had the chart of what reps you were doing and what that was actually going to be doing for your body.
Yeah, and it was
like 1 to 4 builds power and strength. And it would be like 4 to 8 was your hypertrophy range. And anything above 10 was about stamina. And that kind of like mythos has all been busted now by all these studies, because you can gain hypertrophy in high reps as long as you're working hard enough, as long as you have the intensity. Because the problem is people would take the lighter weights and it would be easy, and they would then not understand why they haven't got the progression. It's just because the challenge wasn't there. Because at the end of the day, it's a muscle recruitment game. If you, I mean, again, we'll go back to the example of the chest. If you do a really heavy bench press for 4 reps, on each of those 4 reps, you're needing to recruit quite a lot of your pectoral muscles to get the weight moving. So the actual amount of fibers being recruited at once is very high on all 4 reps. Whereas if you go with a lighter weight and do more reps, less muscle fibers will need to be recruited to lift the weight, but they'll kind of tag in and out. Other fibers will recruit as some fibers fatigue. So if you get the intensity right across these 2 sets, they can actually have quite a similar demand and response within the muscle itself. And then it then comes down to, well, what can I repeatedly do consistently over a long period of time? And this is where, for example, someone like myself gets much more success with medium to higher rep ranges, because the risk of injury is so much lower. And it means I can continue recruiting less muscles, but more repeatedly over a long period of time than going really heavy and spending a week on the bench every month because I've injured myself. So there's a balance to be found for every individual. But I think, that there is a place for all rep ranges within hypertrophy, I think.
I think so. And this is one of the things I wanted to talk about. When you're organizing the sort of the meso and the macro cycle, so when you're trying to plan out your training over the course of the year, the thing is you need to do different rep ranges and different rep schemes. And you need to train in different blocks, doing those different rep ranges and different schemes to maximize that muscle mass potential over the course of the season. And if you just train the same way all the time, then I think you limit your potential to growth. And that's why I'm always sort of saying, like, there's no such thing as a perfect plan, perfect training program, because there's no one plan. It's multiple plans put in a bigger holistic picture, I think. Strength training, let's just touch on that briefly, because I've done a lot of that and strongman, powerlifting, things like that. Essential for loads and strength training?
You should tell us, boss.
It's really, I mean, unfortunately, if you do want to get strong, I mean, for muscle building, slightly different, and you do build muscle when you strength train as well. And there's nice correlations between strength of an individual. I mean, they're almost 1-to-1 combinations, and muscle mass. You can see it clearly, but it also probably ties in quite nicely with length of time training at the same time. Like we have to factor that in as well. But yeah, you have to use the heavy loads if you want to get stronger. That's the thing, and that is working in those rep ranges that you're talking about, Dave, which is doing that between the 4s to the 2s, or the 2s to the 6s at the same time. And you have to do a combination of power training, so doing the stuff like the box jumps, the plyometrics, the lighter weight for speed, and at the same time doing the strength stuff as part of a holistic approach. Because we talked about central nervous system fatigue. When you strength train, you get a high amount of fatigue. You don't necessarily get as much muscle soreness. You don't get that metabolic stress in the same way the lactic acid buildup, but your body takes a pounding. And one of the big things about strength training for powerlifting or for strongman, I maintain this, like that sort of training for strongman is harder than bodybuilding, in my opinion, because you just go into every session just getting crushed. You just get crushed, and it really wears you down. So taking things like deloads are super important when you're doing that. programming effectively is super important, because for a really hard session, you can see reductions in force production. And there's nice studies on this that show that that can be reduced for, say, 12 days after a really hard session. So if you really, really smash it and you're doing too many sets and you're not clever, then it makes a difference. Obviously, we want to have periods whereby we want to do overreaching, so really trying to get that overtraining effect. But again, that's a whole other sort of story from there. Natalie, you're a strong woman. You are a strong woman. So you've got some good numbers on your squats, your bench, your deadlifts. So I know you've got some perspective on this. And I love to power build. And I kind of know you do a bit of that training yourself, because I programmed it for you.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Just kind of on this one.
Absolutely. I mean, it doing those kind of pushing for those kind of lower reps and the heavier weight, it is just, it's the way it feeds through then into your following programming as well. When you go back to more of a hypertrophy training and you realize that the loads that you can actually lift for reps are so much greater from actually having that strength phase and actually doing that. But as you say, you do notice the cumulative fatigue going through that as you reach the end of that block. It does take its toll on the body. And if you're going to get kind of little niggles and little aches and pains, that's when they tend to come out. But absolutely, totally agree that that's something you have to do to enable you to progress sometimes with your hypertrophy training, because again, it comes back to, if you're training in the same rep range and doing the same exercises, you reach a ceiling, you can't push past. So to obviously go back and take things back to, building up your strength in those lower rep ranges, when you then come back to certain movements that you haven't been performing, the increases, it's just going to benefit you from a muscle gain perspective, and how hard and the intensity that you can use in those sessions.
100%. It's that classic cliche term that the plateau buster is what it really is. Getting good at those compound strength lifts. Once you're programming your cycle, it makes you really quite good at those little isolation lifts. You've just got so much more, and it allows you to train at a higher RPE. The mistake me and you made, Dave, when we were younger, is we went way past technical failure and knackered ourselves, so that when we got a little bit older, we were like, we back off a little bit on those strength training sets. But yeah, strength training, you have to do it. And in terms of a frequency, strength training really does seem to benefit from a higher frequency on this one. I want to touch on advanced training techniques, because I realize we spent a long time talking about intensities and loads from there. I suppose, who wants to come in on this? Dave, explain to us what an advanced training technique is, and give us some examples.
Okay, so if you think,
failure's one, but yeah,
an advanced training technique would be something that isn't just your standard do a set of 8, take a rest, do another set. So advanced training techniques can be different things. They can be manipulation of the amount of repetitions you do, the rest that is taken between the exercises, the combination of that exercise with another exercise, whether it's a agonist superset, for example, which will be 2 exercises moving in the same direction, or an agonist antagonist superset, like a push-pull combination, or even just doing something where it's the same exercise, but to squeeze the maximal out of it, you'll do a drop set. You'll do 8 reps with one weight, take some weight off of it, do another 8 to kind of, again, ask the body questions it can't answer. And I mean, there are so many different ones that you can utilize, but some of the more common ones I think would be things like supersets, combining exercises together, drop sets, dropping the weight during one set of an exercise, and like manipulation of rest periods, either like very short rest periods between exercises to challenge the fatigue on it. That would be the kind of ones I would normally use.
Nice one. Natalie, advanced training techniques, chuck in a few more for us. What other ones have you got?
The one that I thought tied quite nicely to what we were talking about before, about using the lighter weight, so kind of tempo training.
That's nice.
Really good.
Like slow negatives, kind of isometric holds at the bottom of the movement, where you can make that lightweight challenging in other ways, so it doesn't mean that you have to constantly be adding weight to the bar. I mean, we talked about it before. One of my favorites is well, I actually do quite like a pre-exhaust, if I'm doing something like squatting, so kind of go and do some leg extensions before I squat, And obviously the idea behind that being that you fatigued, you know, the muscle fibers through the leg extensions in your single joint movement. So the idea being that you recruit more muscle fibers squatting. And again, it means you don't have to go as heavy on your squats. So again, that's something that ties back to the lighter weights. And I think the other one that I use quite frequently is sort of a form of sort of cluster sets. But I'll do it.
They're really good. Yeah, to explain them to the listener.
I'll do it in the format of like a muscle round. So it'd be like 6x4 reps with like 10 seconds in between each. Again, that's another way to make a lighter weight really challenging. So I think all the ones that I really like are the ones where you can get that same intensity from that lighter weight.
Okay, I mean, our ProPrep clients will know there's a really nice, I say it's really nice because I did the presentation. There's a really nice video that we've got on probably about 25 different types of advanced training techniques that you can utilize. Just to throw another few in there, we've got things like partials. So that is where you do a partial movement. Useful from a strength training perspective. There might be a part in a movement that you're particularly weak in. Deadlift's a classic one. Sometimes people will do like a deadlift from a block or from an even greater range of motion, or there's things like that. You've got things like AMRAPs, which is as many reps as possible. You can modify a cluster set to be like a strength-based set, or you can modify it to be kind of like a hypertrophy-based set. So you maybe do 3 reps, rest for 30 seconds, and then try another 3 reps. Or if you want to make it more hypertrophy-based, then you might do 5 reps, rest for 30 seconds, do 5 reps, and then do another 30 seconds, and then go again for 5 reps. And that's a total set of 15. So you're really in your hypertrophy zone from there. You've got things like matrix sets. So a matrix set would be kind of like a partial. The classic example is the bicep curl 21. So you do the top of the movement, you do the bottom of the movement, and then you combine the whole movement from there. It doesn't have to be sets of 7, 7, and 7. You can do 5, 5, 5. There's no reason you can't do 10, 10, 10. You can do things like that as well. I think from a strength training perspective, there's so many cool ones that you can do. I love adding things like chains to a movement, and what that can do is it can make the concentric portion of a movement, and that's motion where you're pushing up the way very often. Good example would be bench press. If you put chains on a bench press, as you take the load down, the load will get lighter because the chains start to hit the floor, and as you push it up, the load gets heavier. Again, great for sticking points as well. Negatives. So we talk about the eccentric motion. You can lift a lot more weight. Research is very clear on this. Taking a weight down under tension than if you were to try and extend it during the concentric phase from there. So an example again is the bicep curl. We can lower a heavier weight than we can actually curl it during the concentric phase. And we know from the research that causes much more muscle damage. And in my days when I was an exercise scientist, we used to get people to do studies where we were trying to induce DOMs. And the best way to do that was to do things like just getting them to do 10 sets of 10 eccentrics. Yeah, and they would be in agony. And then we'd give them a supplement to see if it would like make it less sore for them. It never worked. They just ended up sore. But I mean, it's amazing what you can get people to do for a £10 Amazon voucher. Students.
Sign me up. Sign me up.
So there's a whole sort of gamut of these advanced training techniques you can do. Do you need to do them? Do you not need to do them is my next question, right? That's my next question. Dave, come in.
I think there's a time and a place. And what I was going to say before you even asked the question was, a lot of times, and this comes up a lot more with online coaching now, just as it did with PT, is coaches will sometimes put all these in. It's like a footballer who wants to look good will do lots of step overs and flares. Putting all these advanced training techniques into a plan, it gives it razzle dazzle and can sometimes give it a bit of shock and awe for a new client of like, wow, this trainer really knows what they're doing. But the thing you've got to be aware of is, are these advanced training techniques the right ones for me, my goals, my mechanical makeup, and like my exercise history? So you wouldn't give someone who is a new lifter some like really advanced brutal cluster sets or a matrix for their lower back. You know what I mean? Like it needs to be the right ones in the right time for the person. But I think, I mean, especially the ones you mentioned, Natalie, it's funny how you mentioned all the ones I'm actually doing in my own current training and I didn't speak about them at all. Things like the tempo reps and stuff like that. It was like, So I use all of that because it's a great way to get to failure for me without going with a crazy heavy weight and risk crocking myself 2 weeks out from show. So by doing tempo work, that's the perfect fit for my training at the moment. But for someone who's doing strongman, tempo training isn't what they want to do at all. They need to have snap and speed in the movement.
Power, yeah.
And power. So their advanced training techniques need to focus on that. So it's kind of picking what the goal is and then finding the technique that's going to match it when you make that plan and put it together. And that's how you decide whether or not they're going to be necessary for the person, in my opinion.
That's nice. Okay, Natalie, do you have a rebuttal, or do you want
No. I mean, the big one that I would have kind of said is the experience level. So you absolutely wouldn't start doing advanced training techniques before you've mastered the fundamentals. Like, get good at the fundamentals first and the movements. There's no point chucking in these advanced training techniques if you're not getting stronger, on the basics. It's probably the main factor that I would say. There has to be, an assessment of someone's kind of previous experience, where they're at, and is it going to add any value. I would only really sort of suggest using them when you've got a little bit of experience under your belt, you've been through kind of almost that newbie phase. Because at the end of the day, when you first start training, just doing the basics and the fundamentals is going to stimulate that muscle growth. It's perhaps when you get a little bit further down the line that you need new techniques to kind of trigger that growth, really.
Yeah, get through those plateaus as well, if you like. Do you know what? Over the last 10 years, like, most of my training is just straight sets. Honestly, a lot of my training is just straight sets. And in terms of, like, if you wanted some rules around this, I would say you're probably maximum 4 advanced training techniques a session. Probably a maximum. Supersets are a little bit different because I think that's a great time saver. So you can kind of build sessions around that sort of philosophy. But I think you're probably looking about 3 or 4 a session, because it does take that RPE all the way up to 10 if you do it properly. And then that really ties in quite nicely to that conversation we're having earlier on about intensity, where we're saying, like, you really want to work at that RPE for not too many sets right at the start. So I always kind of say 3 or 4. Do you guys want to hear some research? I've got some studies here. If we can come in this. Okay, so advanced training techniques on this one. So the one that you were talking about was tension, and Schoenfield did a really nice study on this one, a nice systematic review, and they sort of compared really 6-week periods of doing slow tension stuff, so sets that lasted between 0.8 seconds to 8 seconds, over a 6-week period. And the kind of thing for hypertrophy that it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference if you're doing it a little bit faster or doing it really, really slow. Again, there's always caveats, like, how trained are these people? 6 weeks as the study is, and how well are you engaging it? In terms of failure, because this is a big one, because that's an advanced training technique as well as going to failure, they kind of show that for strength training, it's probably best not to go to failure. And that kind of reflects my experience. I don't know if that matches your experience, Natalie, but getting good sets under your belt rather than failing when you're trying to build the squat or the deadlift or the bench, I have always found it's more conducive towards building strength than failing sets. So that research kind of matches that. Again, if you look at these large systematic reviews, again, Schoenfield, he's kind of the GOAT on this stuff. In terms of muscle hypertrophy, they kind of show that there's maybe a slight advantage of taking it to failure with muscle training. However, I look at the statistics on this stuff, and the amount of difference that you're likely to get is very, very small. If it's even a difference at all. Again, training, non-training, length of study, we have to factor these things into to mind as well. And that was Garrick et al. On that. And that was actually published this year. And then I think I've got one more on this one. No, we'll leave it at that. Again, I'll make these studies available for anyone who wants to read these in the comments section below. So who wants to have the last word on this before we wrap this up on intensity and on advanced training techniques? Who's in here?
Okay, I'll jump in. I love jumping in.
Go for it, Dave.
I think advanced training techniques are great, but the king is intensity. If you take consistency out, obviously we've not been discussing consistency of training.
Okay, yeah.
Working
we
hard.
assumed that, yeah.
Yeah, working hard when you're in the gym is the most important thing. You can do straight sets, you can do advanced training techniques, you can do the most elaborate workout plan in the world, but none of it is a substitute for making sure you're challenging yourself. And as we said before, asking your body questions that it can't quite answer, because that's what's going to trigger the adaptation long term. All these other things are just vehicles to help make that happen.
Of course. And I said you'd get the last word, Dave. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, listeners, for listening to our podcast. Hopefully you found it interesting. Again, like I said right at the start, if you think ProPrep coaching can help you, then we'd love to hear from you. Please do get in touch at our website, www.proprepcoaching. Please do check out the first podcast we did on the roundtable discussion. Coach Rob joins us on that one as well. All that's left to say is thank you for your attention, and enjoy your lifting, and get your proteins in you, and we'll see you for the next podcast. Again, we're going to continue this discussion about training. If there's anything that you want us to talk about, though, then please do let us know. All right, over and out. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.